welcome back for yet another video. Today I'm going to be showing you how I made this dress from Mimi Atachi from Yugioh Sevens. I did make a few adjustments to this dress to have it be more a traditional Lolita silhouette while still paying homage to the character's design. If you'd like to see how I made it, then keep on watching. Starting off, we have the materials. I have pink cotton, white cotton for the collar and cuffs, a white poly cotton for the lining, interfacing for the collar, a dark coral pink cotton for her waist ties, a zipper, white heart lace around 1 inch wide to be most of the small details on her dress, another white heart lace around 2.5 inches wide for her skirt hem, white velvet ribbon, and white buttons. For the first step, we are going to be altering the pattern. For the dress, we are going to be using the McCall's pattern 7500 as a base. The main adjustment I did to this pattern was to alter the center panel so it would have a higher neckline to accommodate the addition of a collar. This new center panel was also widened, so the original 1/8 wide Pentax are now 1/4 wide. I think it's much easier to sew and makes it a more prominent design element. To make each pin tuck twice as large, the total amount needs to be doubled. So what was originally 1.5 inches of fabric needed to make the pin tucks now needs to be 3 inches. So the entire pattern must be increased by 1.5 inches to accommodate the larger pin tucks. As for the pattern, by doing that on each side by 3/4, then we get the 1.5 inches. This seems like a lot of math, but if I can figure it out, so can you. Next step is making the pin tucks. So pin tuck guidelines were drawn on my fabric with a water-soluble pen and then pinned in place and sewn. To give yourself a guide, I tried to line up the edge of the pin tuck fold with the left-hand opening of my presser foot so I could see the edge as I was sewing. Now for sewing the seams, I sewed the front and front side seams with the trim added in between. For the back, I added darts and also sewed the shoulder seams. I followed the same steps as making the bodice to make the lining, but except I didn't create pin tucks on the lining. I just cut the center front to be the size of the bodice as it would be after all the pin tucks were made. So I folded out my pattern to remove the pin tucks width and used that to cut down the materials for the lining. I also added buttons to the front of the bodice at this time before the lining was attached. Our next step will be making the skirt. So for the skirt, the side panels were sewn together and then pressed, and then I pressed up 5/8 from the bottom to start to create the hem. From here, that press section was then folded inward to hide the raw edges and then sewn. On the top of the skirt, there's 2 lines of gathering stitches that were pulled to make the skirt fit around my waist. And around 3 inches from the bottom, I added a velvet ribbon all the way around the bottom of the skirt. For the collar, I made a pattern by tracing around my finished neckline shape. I added seam allowance to this pattern. I added trim around my collar and turned it right side out. Next up, we have working on the sleeves. For the sleeves, I used my Simplicity Sailor Suit pattern that I often reference here as my base. I sewed gathering lines around the cuff area as well as an easing stitch on the shoulder. I added interfacing to the backs of the cuff pieces. I sewed the same ribbon on the cuff piece as marked by the pattern, and also added trim to the notched side. I sewed together the ends of the lace with a French seam, as well as sewed the side seams of the cuffs and the sleeves. Once I had sewn the cuff to the sleeves, I turned over half of the cuff to the wrong side and slip stitched over the area of the seam to enclose the raw edges. So for the neckline, I sewed the collar to the outer layer of the bodice first, and when I added the lining, I was able to hide the raw edge. To keep the lining from poking out, I understitched the collar and ironed the heck out of it to make it stay inside. I decided to also make a matching head bow and waist bow to go with this dress to make it more appropriate for Lolita cords. I based my measurements off of designs in the first Otome no Sewing book. I think I will make a separate video in the future going over my process with making the head bow, so look forward to that in the future. I made the skirt lining in a similar way to the outer layer, but I shortened it by about 1 inch. I want to have a peekaboo lace trim that you often see attached to the lining in angelic pretty dresses. I also wanted the wrong sides of the outer and lining layers to face each other so the raw edges would stay concealed. To have the wrong sides face, you have to sew the trim over the right side of the lining instead of over the folded over hem like normal, as you see here. Now we move on to the final construction of the dress. I sewed the outer skirt to the bodice and then sewed up the bottom of the skirt until the marked area where the zipper would go to. I did the second step with the lining and then attached it to the waistline as well. I then went and added the zipper, which for the top section I did by folding the ends of the bodice outer and lining layers inside to hide the raw edges. To hide the raw edges along the sleeves and waist, I would press the seam inwards and hand sew the bodice lining over top of the seam. On the sleeve seams, they were directed away from the armhole, and on the waist seams, they were pressed upwards into the bodice. For the waist ties, I used another pattern from the Otome no Sewing book, but I also checked the sizing for the waist tie with the dress I already had. It's pretty simple, just 2 layers sewn together and then flipped out, and with a buttonhole added on the top. I also sewed 2 heart-shaped buttons that were larger than the ones I had on my bodice on the sides of the waist. After that, the dress was done. I'm really happy with how this turned out. Throughout this process, there were a few things I went back and fixed to make it as perfect as I could. I really wanted to take my time and create the best dress I could, and I'm really glad it paid off in the end. I can't wait until cons are like a thing again so I can wear Mimi as a cosplay there, but in the meantime I will have this dress to enjoy in my daily wardrobe. Thank you guys, as always, so much for watching. Please let me know if you enjoyed this video in the comments below, and I will see you all next time. Bye!